Dr. James Tabor is retiring from his prolific career in New Testament studies, guys.
Because I consider it a privilege to have done these things. And I also want to say that retire for me simply means I'll no longer be teaching full-time in a university. And before UNC Charlotte, as you know, Neal, I taught at the University of Notre Dame. I want to talk about that. The bastion of Roman Catholic theology. I taught there for 7 years. And I'm not Roman Catholic. I was one of the few non-Roman Catholics. And I also taught at the College of William and Mary. So 45 years altogether. Started when I was, 8 years old, you think? Something like that, Neal? No. Anyway, might be older than, maybe I don't look as old as I am, or maybe I look older. I don't know. But yeah, so we're going to talk about, want to do super chats and raise some money for Derek's move.
Yeah.
It's almost like Ask Me Anything.
Yeah.
But when Derek asks me the theme, and we'll take your questions and so forth, but give me a little chance to lay some things out, because it might even set some parameters for you as to what I wanted to cover in terms of my own career. But as far as retire, it's in scare quotes, because I guarantee you I will be probably double to triple times more active in other ways, teaching and traveling and leading tours and doing things in Israel and projects, things that I didn't have time to do when I was teaching full-time. Full-time teaching, people don't realize it. It's about a 50 to 60 hour a week job. It really is, with all that you do administratively. And anybody that's a professor that hears this will vouch for that. So think of suddenly, let's say you had a 50 hour a week job, and suddenly someone said, okay, you're done. You're free. You can do what you want. And yet I'm still James Tabor, the quester for the historical Jesus and everything else I do. So I'm just like a coil spring, kind of wound up, and I'm just ready to burst forth. This is my first interview since I'm officially retired July 1st. So
excellent.
Love doing it with you, Neal. Thanks for.
When I heard I was going to be able to go on live with you, I was honored. So.
Yeah, so here's how if it's okay with you, and you can jump in with questions and just kind of watch the super chat.
Yeah, we already have a few, just so you know.
Yeah, let's let them build up just a little, because I want to get started. I'm going to give you a little bit of bio. People, you know how you get hundreds of comments, and I have my YouTube channel, James Tabor Videos. You can find it. It has over 90 videos. It's doing really well. Please subscribe and hit notifications if you want it. If you want to know when I post something. But what I want to tell you, people are asking a lot of times in the comments, well, what do you believe, or where do you come from, or how are you raised? Because I'm kind of a new figure to YouTube. And so I want to give you a little bio that I hope you'll find educational as well as interesting. I was raised in an evangelical Christian setting, Churches of Christ. And in college, I went to Abilene Christian University, and I majored in biblical languages and began to study history of Christianity and so forth. But I got a really solid education there. Even though it's a conservative school by some measures, it's fully in touch with historical critical studies and so forth. And then I went to Pepperdine University and did Second Temple Judaism, and then I went to the University of Chicago. So very early on, I began to understand that my interest was utterly drawn to what I would call the Jesus movement, and what Schweitzer called the quest of the historical Jesus. What can we know about Jesus? How can we know it? Is there a way to reconstruct or get back to understanding the movement more thoroughly? Now, toward the last of our time together today, Neal, I want to address what's in the title. It was suggested by me to Derek. how my mind has changed and stayed the same. So I won't do that now. It could come out in some of the super chats.
Sure.
But I want to just talk about the quest a little bit. I've got here my original edition of Albert Schweitzer in English.
Wow.
This is the first edition. It was published in German in 1906. My Jesus book, coincidentally, was published, The Jesus Dynasty, in 2006. So exactly 100 years later after this monumental book. I don't claim to even stand in the shadow of Albert Schweitzer, but by far he's my most influential person. This book in German, you may or may not know, was called Von Reimarus zu Reda. I know, what does that even mean? From Reimarus, a person, right? Gottfried Reimarus, a German theologian, to Reda. So he basically starts in the 1750s. Think of about the time the United States was founded, the Enlightenment, John Locke, David Hume, these people. That's when he starts, and he's tracing the history of what he calls the quest. And then he comes toward the end of the book, the latter third, to himself. Now, when he covers Reimarus, the very first person that he covers, I want to just tell you a little bit about that. I know Derek has a series coming up with Dale Allison. It's a class, actually, Dale Allison Jr., and it's on the quest for the historical Jesus. So I'm not going to go into any depth, but the reason I'm covering this is I want to relay it to where I am in the quest. So to do that, I got to give you just a little bit of background. And many of your listeners know this stuff. But I wonder who's heard of the Lessing ditch. It's Lessing. That's a person's name. And the ditch became proverbial in the late 1700s. It's how do you tell the difference between the theological Christ and the historical Jesus? That's how Lessing formulated it. And Lessing is the one who published Reimarus, the guy that Schweitzer starts with. So right early on, these early researchers of Jesus were beginning to say, what we believe theologically, like virgin birth, resurrection of the dead, ascent to heaven, the miracles of Jesus, and so forth, maybe those have to do more with a mythological Christ figure, whereas the historical Jesus could be different from that. That's the basic problem of the quest, the kind of two horns. And as you know from your own background, if you go all the way to the myth side, the theological construction side, you kind of lose the history. And if you go all the way to the history, you sort of lose, well, what happened as a result of his life? You could reduce Jesus down to almost a cipher. So basically, I want to talk about that Lessing ditch, that theological ditch. Now, according to Schweitzer, when he writes his book, he says there are two things about Jesus studies. So I'm going to summarize over 200 years according to Schweitzer. Before David Strauss and after David Strauss. So if you don't know David Strauss, David Friedrich Strauss, 1835, he's 27 years old. Imagine this. Wow. You're going to be 33 in October, I remember, because you said you're going to turn 33 on our trip to Israel.
Yep.
We're going to have to do some live celebrations over YouTube for that day. But anyway, 1835, he's 27. He publishes his 2 volumes.
Wow.
It's 1,400 pages, 2 volumes, called Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined. Okay. That appeared in English not too long after. You know who translated it? Let me ask you this, Neal, and this will tell me about our 2 generations. I went to school in the 50s. You probably went in the 90s, right? Like, what was your high school?
Graduated in 07.
Okay, so did you read Silas Marner? Do you ever remember that? I bet some people listening will
The
remember
name
that.
is I know the
It's
I've heard
it's
the
a famous book
yeah.
written by George Eliot. But guess what? George Eliot is a woman. George Eliot is Marian Evans, who couldn't publish and get published, one of the greatest American writers, because she was a woman.
Oh,
And
wow.
so she wrote The Mill on the Floss. She wrote a number of very, very important books. She, George Eliot. So there you go. You know, that we were talking about gender transfers much earlier than in the modern period. Now, why do I mention her? Because she translated Strauss
Wow.
into English, where it could really have a major impact. You can get it today on Amazon. I really recommend it. And it's a shortened version. Let me read you two things Schweitzer says about Strauss.
Sure.
And this is going to lead to my own career. I'm getting there. He says, in order to understand Strauss, this is Albert Schweitzer, the great, one must love him. He was the most absolutely sincere. His insight and his errors were like the insight and errors of a prophet. He had a prophet's fate. He also says about the book, he considers him prophetic. He says, considers as a literary work, Strauss's Life of Jesus is one of the most perfect things in the whole range of learned literature. Listen to this. Over 1,400 pages, he does not have a single superfluous phrase. Can you imagine? So should you read Strauss, according to Schweitzer, he doesn't even have a sentence or phrase that you would take out. His analysis descends to the minutest details, but he does not lose in any way. The style is simple, picturesque, ironical, but dignified and distinguished. This is what Schweitzer says about Strauss. He says other things before Strauss, after Strauss. He's after Strauss. I'm after Strauss. So we're all on the shoulders of Strauss
Right.
and in the shadow of Strauss. He also says that Strauss wrote the death notices to hundreds of attempts to capture the historical Jesus that still seem to have a little air in them until you examine their corpse and they're dead. Again, Schweitzer's colorful language. So he basically began to argue for the first time this difference between the Christ of faith and, or theology, you could say, and the Jesus of history. And he was so scandalous because he rejected a lot of the miraculous material, certainly the virgin birth and many of the things. He did think Jesus was probably a healer. He was surprisingly modern. We're talking about 1835, and we're still discussing some of these things today. You guys on YouTube all the time are discussing the issues that Strauss pioneered. So I know a lot of people haven't heard of him. I want to give allegiance to him, to David Friedrich Strauss. He's the one who really kicked it all off. And I have one more line from Schweitzer I just have to read.
Absolutely.
Because Schweitzer's so colorful. It's at the first of a chapter here. Let me just find. He has 3 chapters on Strauss. So this one is the best. It shows you Schweitzer too.
Yeah.
He says, scarcely has ever a book let loose such a storm of controversy. We're talking about after 1900 years, in this case, 1800 years, 1835, exactly 1800 years if Jesus is around 30, right? For the first time, we're beginning to wonder, how do we know about Jesus? Could we search him out historically, or do we just go to church and say the Apostles' Creed and sing the hymns and eat his body and blood and just believe so that we can go to heaven when we die? Now, people are questioning religion at this time, no doubt. But the big thing is, what about Jesus? Jesus is such a dominant figure. And the Bible, right? And the New Testament that, billions of people believed and still believe. So it could be dangerous. But here's what he said. So there's never been a book, never, that let loose such a storm of controversy. The fertilizing rain brought up a crop of toadstools. After 40 or 50 essays, which appeared in the next 5 years, There are only 4 or 5 of any value, and their value is very small. This is Schweitzer again. So he's saying, oh my God, we've got 45 people responding to Strauss. They're all toadstools. As soon as the sun comes up, they dry up. And yeah, there's 4 or 5 that maybe you could look at. But so he has a chapter on Strauss's opponents.
Wow.
Now, what about the man, though? This is Albert Schweitzer, who's standing on the shoulders of Strauss. I want to say I'm standing on the shoulders of Schweitzer, but I don't feel worthy. I really recommend this book. You can get it in English. Everyone should read it. You'll hear people say, well, there's the second quest and the third quest, and there's the new quest, and Schweitzer's out of date. Believe me, a lot of people that talk about Schweitzer have never read Schweitzer. He was such a great human being. He was such a great, amazing man. I won't go into his biography. But anyway, when you look at historical Jesus studies, and these are people by and large who are before me, some of them are contemporary with me, but you think of some of the polarities that we have. Dominic Crossan, Dom, Derek also has a new series with Dom. I saw one the other day that he released ahead of time just to whet people's appetite. I think of Dom Crossan and Dale Allison as 2 of the poles for me.
Yeah.
What I like about them both is they explain their methods, and I'm going to explain my method as I get to this. The quest for historical Jesus. Even if you don't agree with Crossan, who says Jesus is more of a Stoic, Cynic philosopher type and not so eschatological and not so much a part of Second Temple Judaism in the way that others have argued. You know, he's beyond that, a kind of Hellenistic guy, which I also believe to some degree.
Me too.
At least he tells you his methods. That's the beauty of Crossan. He's a beautiful speaker. He's a beautiful writer. People are going to love these interviews. But this is where he ends up. Allison, in his Reconstructing Jesus, now he has a little book about Jesus. He has actually a book called The Jesus of Theology and the Christ of History, where he reverses the Lessing thing to kind of have fun with it, you know, because there's a theological Jesus and there's also a historical Christ. So anyway, Allison is Constructing Jesus. That's his big method book. It's a tough read. Highly recommended, along with his new book on resurrection. And then we got John Meyer at Notre Dame. You know, I taught at Notre Dame. John wasn't there then. I think he was at Emory. But John's got 5 volumes about Jesus, the Mediterranean peasant. That's kind of the most mainstream. We got Bart Ehrman, Paula Fredrickson. You remember Geza Vermish, who wrote Jesus the Jew, E.P. Sanders, the historical figure of Jesus. These are all things that you've got to read and absorb if you want to get into.
And these are all generational talent scholars that you're mentioning, by the way.
They really are. And, you know, I'm glad.
By the way, you're in that list, dude. You are. No. You are on that list.
I could be to some people, maybe. Let's say the common people heard me gladly, but other than that,
if I had to make a guess, if I had to make a prediction, let's say 200, 100 years from now, when everybody here that's in this live stream, we're all passed away, and generations later, there are going to be scholars that are going to be using your work as source material.
James, we'll see. We'll see. Meaning, I won't see, but someone.
There's going to be some new myth vision in the virtual reality world of the internet, because it's not.
We'll see.
And
but
they're going to be.
I'm not just being modest here. I mean, I've learned from all of these colleagues and scholars tremendously. I know I'm more speculative than others because I do things on the father of Jesus, the biological father that most people avoid. Just say it. Most scholars would just say it's Joseph. Forget it. You and I did a show, I think, on Pantera, which I recommend. And I do things on the Talpiot tomb and things like that. But I mean, the Jesus dynasty is my take on Jesus, and it is my own, and I explain my methods of going about trying to reconstruct as best we can. Sure. But I dedicate it to Albert Schweitzer, and it's very much in the direction of Schweitzer. So basically what the person I learned from most was my dissertation advisor, Jonathan Z. Smith. He's the great historian of religions. He served as president of the American Academy of Religion, president of the Society of Biblical Literature, just an amazing scholar. And his article, which you can get online, called Hellenistic Religion, I would say you will learn more about religion in the ancient world from that article, Encyclopedia Britannica article, because he's a genius at insights. He wrote his dissertation on Fraser's Golden Ballast. You can imagine. I mean, he is just ubiquitous throughout the ancient world. He's also absolutely a genius. It's kind of a silly term to use for somebody like Smith, but just the most brilliant man. I was so honored to work with him. And I work with him on Paul. And normally he would be much broader. And then I worked with Robert M. Grant, University of Chicago, the great church historian. And I work with Norman Perrin, the great New Testament scholar. So I had Hellenistic religions, broadly speaking, ancient Mediterranean world, Jonathan Z. Smith, nobody better. Robert Grant, I don't know that there's a better historian. I was so fortunate to arrive at Chicago when these three persons were there. Norman Perrin, who taught me Mark. I'm going to do a series with Derek on Mark, a class on Mark. And it's going to blow people away because I've been teaching Mark for 45 years. I initially taught what I learned from Perrin, but I still, a lot of what I do is from Perrin, and I give him credit. But I've also, through teaching and study, evolved into other views from the Gospel of Mark. And so that's basically my background, my educational background, my assumptions. So I want to be part of this quest for the historical Jesus. But let's take some of your questions so we don't build up too much. And then I'm going to get into a little bit later how my mind has changed and stayed the same and so forth.
Yeah. If the super chats keep going, we'll just keep answering them. But if we run out, we'll just go back to the conversation of how you got to the point.
Yeah, and even if they run out, I still want to get to. I mean, even if they don't run out, I want to get to that a little bit because I got 2 or 3 things I want to tell you about my approach.
I got all night, so
let's see what we got here. You read them to me because I'm on my iPhone. But
first of all, I want to just say welcome, Pinch, for becoming a member. You are part of a great community, and you made the right choice. So, welcome for joining the membership. That's the first one that came up. And the next one is from Stop Scamming Man. Great friend of the channel. Thank you for the super chat. I, too, want to change views if I'm wrong. By my understanding, though not convicted, Oded Golan was found to be manufacturing items with the Joash Stele being a Crusader castle slab. What is your take?
Yeah, that becomes kind of personal in the sense that I'd be talking about Oded himself, whom I know. My only competence in that area would be the James ossuary. And I do think when you say convicted, I believe...
Though not convicted, it says.
Okay, I didn't read it. Yeah, the trial didn't say that Oded wasn't a forger. I think that's what Stop Scamming is part of what he wants to make clear, and that's true. But the case wasn't established that he was, in fact, a forger. My own sense of him personally, I've met him, I've talked to him and interviewed him and so forth, is that he's not one of these guys that's manufacturing things and selling them. And there's some questions about, the Joash Stele. Obviously, many think it's a forgery. But the James ossuary, the last letters, the accusation was, that's the one that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That brother of Jesus might have been added. I don't think that's the case. And there's quite a bit I've written about it. And I also think it comes from the Talpiot tomb. I've written about that fairly recently on my blog, if people want to look back. But the manufacturing thing, I know there were, there were accusations about some tools in his workshop and so forth. But Oded is a collector. He told me, and if this is wrong, I think it would have come out in the trial. He told me that he has never sold any item in his collection ever. He doesn't sell antiquities. He's a collector, but he loves them and keeps them. And his house is his place of display. And just like Musayyaf, who was probably the greatest collector of antiquities, biblical and ancient antiquities, who's now passed away, Oded is just a lover of the material. And I would be hesitant to say much about it. So my take would be, I'm not the person to ask about the Joash stele.
Sure. Are you talking about the Masada with the thick glasses, the old guy? The other guy you're talking about? Not
Musayyaf?
Yeah.
I don't know. He had glasses. I don't think that's who you're talking about, though. No.
Well, he was on Naked Archaeologist, and he was a collector, and he had.
He could be, yeah. Back then, yeah. He's passed. I bet it was him, yeah.
Yeah.
But Oded, I think Oded is a trustworthy character. I really do. But since I've written about that so much, and if my book Jesus and Paul has a whole chapter on the ossuary, bringing you up to date with the latest, I've written articles about it. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for the super chat. The next one, thank you for the super chat. Ask Tabor why he thinks a historical Jesus existed. What evidence? I just read it that way. I don't know why, but it just felt like that's how he meant it.
Well, I can't read the Arabic letters for his name, so
I can't either. I apologize, but thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, we welcome you. Thank you. Have to be a separate program, but for me, I think the letters of Paul, the 7 letters of Paul particularly, that I've read a few thousand times in Greek and studied, they seem to me to come from a personality in a single hand, identified as Paul. I've written 2 books on Paul and studied him as a thinker and a character. And I think his interchange with Peter and with James and others, and just going back and forth to Jerusalem and dealing with the early Jesus movement, that's where I would start. But I'm very familiar with Richard Carrier and Robert Price. And actually, you need to go back to the 19th century and begin with people that were contemporary with Strauss, who were already suggesting such things. Schweitzer deals with this. It's that kind of pitch between the historical Jesus and the mythological Christ, and where does it go? And if all the Jesus spills into the myth, you kind of lose Jesus.
Right.
But if all the myth spills into the history, you lose, what he was really like as a Jew in the Second Temple period.
Yeah.
So I would, I think it's been addressed. I think Bart Ehrman's book is worth looking at. I will have to say, and this will be an insult to, I guess, the so-called Christ Smithers, but for me, it's not a question. It's not a challenge. It's something that I work with and deal with as a beginning point in a given, trying to then understand the movement from all of our sources, and particularly some of the archaeological sources. And I do think there are archaeological sources that refer to Jesus in the 1st century, and that has to do with ossuary inscriptions and so forth. But there's one in particular that has the sign of a fish with the word Yeshua written in it, and it is a 1st century ossuary.
Wow.
That somebody's put on their ossuary and that sort of thing. Those are all in my book. It would be mostly in the Jesus Discovery. I have a trilogy: the Jesus Dynasty, the Jesus Discovery, and Paul and Jesus. They're all Simon & Schuster books. So if you're interested in that archaeological evidence, you could look at some of that. I wouldn't depend on that to prove Jesus existed, because a legendary mythological character could have inscriptions about them pretty early on. But I've also spent, you mentioned the 70 trips I've made to Israel just in the last 33 years. So much time on the ground and under the ground, looking at the geography, the layout, what Nazareth was in the first century, what Sepphoris was in the first century, what Jerusalem was in the first century. All of that serves to inform my understanding of the historical figure of Jesus, as Sanders calls him. I know that's not an adequate answer,
Sure.
but I guess I should just do a program on it sometime if people are that interested.
Yeah, and I as someone who used to be a mythicist, one of the things that really got me to say, I think there's probably was a guy, was the point about Nazareth and the confusion of the Messiah should be coming from Bethlehem, but he's coming from Nazareth. And if you were going to create a guy, and people have heard this all from other people a million times, so I'm rehashing. I didn't make this up at all. But anyways,
Sure.
if you're gonna create a person, create a son of David character, why not just he is born in Bethlehem?
Well, it's one of many things that you would bring up, and for
Yeah,
me, I would start with the earliest thing we have. What's the earliest thing we have?
Paul.
First Thessalonians, written 50-51.
And Paul does say he's born of a seed of a mortal. So
yes,
he's saying it's a person. It's not saying.
And also, as you know from my other shows I've done, I don't think Philippians 2 is a Christ hymn about a pre-existent deity. I think it's an Adam Christology. And again, too much to get into, but
yeah, no, you're right. We can go on.
But I don't think the excavations at Nazareth are helpful. I don't think they prove Jesus existed, but they certainly prove Nazareth existed. So
yeah, and you, by the way, really, really opened my eyes to the fact that these Tosefta and Mishnah sources probably do go back to an earlier time than people think. And because the way they describe Sepphoris, they're describing it as if they were living in this first century.
Yeah, they're walking on the streets of Sepphoris, right?
Yeah. So
anyway. So let's leave that. But I do appreciate the question, and I hope I said a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Gaius Julius Windex, thank you for the super chat. Who is Jesus Pantera?
Gaius, I love your name. Except for Caligula, right? But there's a bunch of Gaiuses. It's a family name in the Julian-Claudian dynasty. Jesus Pantera, what you're going to hear from just about everybody, and I could be a smartass and go, just about everybody that doesn't know anything about it, is that it's a pun on the Greek word Parthenos. Parthenos, or virgin. And that it's saying, Jesus, you're not a son of a virgin, you're a son of a panther. That it's kind of a way of like slandering Jesus. In my work on Pantera, that's in the book, The Jesus Dynasty, I go into that in great detail. And I think we did an interview on it also, right, Neal? Didn't we do Pantera? I think we did. So listen to that, because we go into a lot of detail as well.
40,000.
But briefly, it's a name of someone in Jesus' family with the name Pantera. There's even an ossuary found from Jerusalem with the name Pantera. I don't think it's a Pantera that's the father of Jesus, but it shows it's a name that can be a Jewish name in the first century, used by a Jew. And I would stay with the first century initially and not go to Celsus, the opponent of Origen, who also mentions Pantera and calls him a Roman soldier. I would leave the Roman soldier out initially and just talk about our early sources. And in our early sources, Neal just mentioned two of them. They have to do with rabbis of the first and early second century walking around the streets of Sepphoris and talking about Jesus of Nazareth, but they call him Yeshua bar Pantera. And they're not doing it in any negative way or pejorative way. They're just saying, that Jesus, because there's other Jesuses. There's quite a few Jesuses in the Talmud. And in the, Ben Sirach, one of the books in the Apocrypha is written by Jesus ben Sirach. It's the name Joshua. That's why it's fairly common. 4.5% of males had the name Jesus. So you're going to run into others. It's not huge, but
Zechariah, the high priest in the book of Zechariah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's also Yeshua. So I don't think it's a pun. And that pun idea, I had a graduate student finally trace it back. It's somebody named Nietzsche, not Nietzsche, the philosopher, but Nietzsche, New Testament scholar. And he put forth that idea in the 1800s that maybe it's a pun on virgin, Parthenos, that Jesus is son of a virgin. Ha, 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 he's really son of a panther. I think it has some historical validity. The first two church historians to respond to the charge, and they believed in the virgin birth, that Jesus didn't have a physical father. The first two were church fathers, and they both said, oh, no, that's a family name. It's in the family of Joseph. That's where Pantera comes from. So they don't particularly have a problem with the name. They just say it's within the family. Like we talk about Caesar is Julius Caesar, but it's also the family dynasty name. Right. And what they're suggesting is that Pantera, and we have two separate sources on this. So who is he? According to that tradition, he would be the biological father of Jesus. Now, whether we can connect him to a Roman soldier, you've got to go all the way to Celsus, which would be, late 2nd century, writing his Contra Celsum, where Origen, he writes a critique of Christianity, and Origen, the Christian philosopher and theologian, writes a book against him, and that's why we have his work. He quotes it. And he says that Mary slept with a Roman soldier and basically implies something like rape. I don't think there's any early evidence of that. So I don't know really who he was, except probably someone in the family of Jesus. And at least there are tales on the ground, you might say, among contemporary Jews who say, well, he's the son of Pantera, a person. And also in the New Testament, there's a scene in the Gospel of John, I think it's in chapter 8, where Jesus' enemies say, we weren't born of fornication, kind of saying like we've heard you have been. Right. And then there's a little bit of a hint maybe in the Gospel of Thomas about the one who knows his father and mother will be called a bastard or something like that. So we've got these kind of things floating around. But as to who he was, I don't think we know. I think Jesus had a biological father. I don't think we know for sure who he was, but Pantera is the name that comes up in our early sources. And so he would have been somebody in the family of either Joseph or Mary that would have that name.
Wow. What a perfect name to ask that question, because you could give an example of the family name in Roman times,
There you go, yeah.
And also, real quick, before we get to the next one, that would explain why there could be this question mark of who his father was, and why Christians have to sort of make him born of a virgin if that's the case. Like, I'm saying, if that could be the way it happened.
Well, as this goes back to David Strauss again. One of the things he said that many people started saying in the 19th century is that kind of material is mythological. Right. It's said about various Greco-Roman figures of the period. In my book, again, The Jesus Dynasty, I don't want to keep mentioning that like I'm hawking the book, but I want you to know where I cover that. That's where I cover all the birth stuff and all the Pantera material, and on my blog. If you don't want to get the book or don't have the book, you can go to my blog, and if you type in Pantera, you'll get probably about 30 posts, and these are thick, significant posts, not just little, 2-paragraph things. They're studies, and you would get all that material just by going to jamestabor.com. So I encourage you to read more. But Strauss said, look, we've got Romulus, we've got Empedocles, we've got Hercules, we've got Plato, so many people that were declared to be, born of a virgin and so forth.
Right.
Or if they weren't born of a virgin, let's say sired by a god.
Sure.
I do want to point out two things, even though I think Matthew probably believed Jesus didn't have a human father. I mean, the Gospel of Matthew, because we don't know who wrote it. But have you noticed in Matthew, Neal, if you read it carefully, it's really not a story about a virgin birth. It's a story about, should I take a pregnant woman who's engaged to me and I know I'm not the father, right? That's the story in Matthew. The whole story is, yes, you should. Go ahead and get married to her. It never says she's a virgin and never known a man. It does say what is conceived of her is of the Holy Spirit. But that could be said about various births in the Hebrew Bible, where God, for example, Abraham and Isaac, God says in the different narratives of Genesis, at this time next year, I will come to you and Sarah will have a child. Okay. Now, I'm not going to unpack that for you, but I just quoted it. This is God talking, the angel of the Lord. I will come to you and Sarah will have a child. But he does say, but it will be of your own seed. So you got to figure all that out. These are different sources in Genesis. But anyway, it's well known, especially in the Greco-Roman world. I have another website called the Jewish Roman World of Jesus .com. And if you go to that, it's linked on the blog. You don't have to write all that down. I put some of those accounts. So anyway, I hope that helps. So let's go ahead.
Yeah. All right. And the next one is from Jesus Saves. Is Jesus in a scene? Thank you for that super chat.
Wow. Neal, what we're going to have to do is just refer them to our interviews, because we did a show on that. Was what kind of a Jew is Jesus? Yeah. But I'm not putting down the question, Jesus saves. And I just will make it really brief because we have a whole show on it. It is a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
First of all, not to dodge it, but it depends on what you mean by an Essene and how you get your view of Essene. What is an Essene? So it's almost like answer a question with a question. So if you're one of my students, this is what I would do, and we're not in class. I would say, you go, Dr. Tabor, is Jesus an Essene? And I would say, oh, Johnny, great question. What is an Essene in your understanding, and how do you know what you know? That's kind of hard and how do you know what you know? Because it can't just be, I think, isn't that, the people that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls or whatever. So it's complicated in this sense. What we know of Essenes is primarily Josephus, Philo, and a couple of other Greco-Roman sources. The Essenes as the third sect of Judaism, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. That's a decent enough description. And you and I talked about this, and you read it carefully. Book 2, Jewish War, Josephus. That's where you want to start. Anyway, that'll give you your view of Essenes. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered 75 years ago in 1947. As they begin to come to light and be read in the 1950s, people said, wait a minute, there are a lot of similarities between that group and this group. And others said, quite early on, and the Jesus movement. So that raises the question, what is the relationship of Jesus to the so-called Essenes? The problem is we have the Dead Sea Scrolls describing an apocalyptic sectarian group, but when Josephus describes the Essenes, he doesn't make them an apocalyptic sectarian group of that sort, a messianic apocalyptic group. He presents them as a Greco-Roman philosophical sect. Do you understand? So that's what makes the comparison difficult. I think he's trying to protect them. he certainly knows, and I think they are an apocalyptic messianic group. But if you're willing to combine the sources and deal with some of the differences, you do get a pretty good composite picture.
Right.
But here's the problem with it, asking about Jesus. It's a problem, and it's also a gift. The gift is you get these incredible parallels. Let me describe it briefly. An apocalyptic messianic movement that if you ask them what they're doing and what they're about, they would say we're the voice of God preparing the way in the wilderness, as it is written, Isaiah 40, verse 3, prepare you the way in the wilderness. Okay, we see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, community rule. We see that as we open our Gospels, Gospel of Mark. What are you, John the Baptist? What are you doing? I'm the voice crying in the wilderness, as it is written, quoting Isaiah 40. That's a pretty good parallel. Apocalyptic, eschatological group. They believe the judgment is near. They believe the kingdom of God is near. They believe it's so near that the generation that's with the teacher, they call him the teacher of righteousness, or the unique teacher, or even the true teacher. It could be translated all those ways, and there are different designations for him in the scrolls. They think it will come within 40 years of his life. Fast forward to Jesus, he dies in 30, and Mark writes maybe around 70 or a little later, and he says this generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. So you get that kind of imminent parallel that the end is near. You're probably going to live to see it. There are other parallels. They dip in water as an initiation rite, which Christians call baptism, Jews call mikveh. So they use the ritual purity not just for states of life like menstruation, sexual intercourse, touching a dead body, that kind of ritual purity. But they also say, and Josephus mentions this as well, that when you go into the pure waters of the mikveh, or baptism, as Christians later call it, means the pool, to dip, that you become a member of the community. So it's like baptism as an initiation rite.
Wow.
So there are lots of other parallels. They have all goods in common. They have meals of sacred bread and wine, and they see it as an anticipation of the kingdom and so forth. So I guess I would say yes and no, but probably no, mostly if you go by what their interpretations of the Torah were all about. Let's stay with the Dead Sea Scroll group, the Qumran group. I believe the Qumran group would have hated Jesus. He's too liberal. He hangs out with women, with tax collectors, with sinners. He's open to Gentiles. He's open to Roman soldiers. He even blesses Roman soldiers and commends them for their faith as being greater than any Jew.
And the Sabbath thing, too. They would hate him for that.
But the main thing, the exact point that we have is the scrolls say in the community rule that if an animal falls into a pit or a well on the Sabbath, say it breaks its leg and it's crying, do not help it, because God says to keep the Sabbath, and that takes precedence over the life of the animal. Even the Pharisees disagreed with that.
Right.
But Jesus brings it up, and he says, which of you would not help an animal out of a pit? So they would consider him ritually impure, much to, I hate to use the word liberal in our current climate, but the idea is like he's not going to be as strict halakhically. Halakhically means, how do you observe the Jewish law? And when you read MMT, which is their letter that they write to the high priest in Jerusalem about the main issues that they disagree with the Jerusalem priesthood about, it all has to do with ritual defilement and purity and how you're doing sacrifices and so forth. From any evidence we have from Jesus on any level of the strata that we have of tradition, he wasn't particularly interested in that sort of thing. So was he an Essene? I would rather stick with Eisenman. He's part of the late Second Temple apocalyptic Jewish messianic movement.
Yeah,
I think that's the way you want to put it. And that way you have streams of tradition. The Qumran group is a stricter stream. But we shouldn't assume that if I'm reading the community rule that I think might date to the 1st century BCE, that would be exactly a description of the group in the time of Jesus. You follow? Because that would be over 100 years later.
Right.
Groups changed. That would be thinking like fundamentalist Baptists in the 1870s, or even going into our day. Jump ahead to the 1970s. Oh, they're basically the same. No, religions develop. They're affected by culture. They're affected by history, and they're affected by apocalyptic disappointment.
And the reason why I wouldn't jump to saying no either is because we don't know how different an Qumran Essene sect is compared to a Nazareth Essene sect. So I'm saying if he was an Essene, you can't rule that out, but you can't say yes for sure either.
Yeah, he's part of the same movement. In other words, none of the things that I named as parallel would be characteristic of Pharisees or Sadducees. None of them. They're not preparing the way in the wilderness. They're not an apocalyptic messianic group and so forth, at least as we know them later in the Mishnah and through the New Testament.
Right.
So remember, we're always going through the filters of our sources.
Sure.
But that's a very great question to talk about. And I've worked at Qumran, I've excavated at Qumran, and I've read the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was involved in the release of some of the scrolls with Wise and Eisenman. And I absolutely believe that they are our greatest source for understanding a certain kind of apocalyptic messianic religiosity that Jesus and John the Baptist and James all share. So I would say to people, whether you agree with all of Robert Eisenman's material, be sure you read it first, because so many critics of Eisenman don't really read what he says. And if you read what he says, and I don't mean his book on James necessarily, that's his magnum opus, but I mean his main early books on the Dead Sea Scrolls, where he's talking about the kind of religiosity and piety that's reflected in the scrolls, that you also see in the book of James in the New Testament, in some of the Q material of the Synoptic Gospels.
Great answer. Great answer. The next one is from Cindy Lamachia. Thank you for the super chat. Is John the Baptist historical?
Oh boy, Cindy. It's same answer on the Jesus historical thing. I would say yes, absolutely. In fact, my understanding of the movement, let me call it, and I guess it gets the tag the Jesus movement because he's kind of the middle guy. But I would say you've got to study 5 people. And Jesus is the one people mainly have studied. But you really need to study John the Baptist, Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, just publishing a book on her called The Lost Mary, wow. Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and James, the brother of Jesus. My whole cluster of Jesus studies is built around those 5 women. My Mary Magdalene is in the book, The Jesus Discovery, because I'm dealing with the Talpiot tomb in the ossuary that may have her name. Now, that leaves out Paul, but I believe those are the big 5. Now, notice that 4 of the 5 have been deep six. Deep six is a term we used in Watergate, where you throw the briefcase in the Potomac River to get rid of evidence. There might be some deep sixting going on in Washington, D.C. this weekend, for all I know, right? With all the controversies going on.
Right.
But anyway, John the Baptist, James, Jesus' mother, and Mary Magdalene, all trashed completely. You say, well, not his mother. She's the most honored woman of history, but not as a Jewish mother of 7 children, or maybe even 9 children, depending on how many sisters and all that might be part of that family. So I'm trying to rehabilitate her as a proud Jewish woman and heroine that I think inspired this family. John the Baptist has been reduced to a forerunner. He's like the guy on the side of the stage that comes out when the play begins, and he goes, okay, everybody, I'm just here to introduce things But here's the main thing, and the curtain goes up, and then you just see Jesus. And then he just goes off the scene. I've written a lot about John the Baptist. Again, in the book, The Jesus Dynasty, there's a whole section on him. I think he's vitally important to Jesus. And we have enough evidence, I think, to certainly make him historical. The Mandeans are still followers of John the Baptist. And even though their literature dates to the 2nd and 3rd century CE, I think it can be critically looked at. There is a pretty good stream of material, I think, that supports John the Baptist. Josephus also mentions him in a very, very interesting passage. So I would say yes, Cindy, he is historical. And I think he's really key to Jesus. Just as James Eisenman would say, if you want to understand Jesus, go to James the Just. That's even in the Gospel of Thomas. And if you also want to understand Jesus, remember he's bracketed by John the Baptizer. And one of the things I mention quite often to my students, and you can take a look at this, I cover it in my blog as well. You can Google any of these topics, John the Baptist, Essenes, Qumran, Pantera. They're all on my blog with lots of articles, and also in the books, of course. But one of the things about him that makes him most interesting is Jesus says in the earliest strata that we have of Luke and Matthew's saying source, he says that among those born of women, there's none greater than John. Now, that gets muted by a scribal addition. Nevertheless, notice it doesn't say, oh, wait, that's wrong. Now notice, born of woman. There's none born of woman greater than John. Born of woman in Hebrew idiom means a human being as opposed to an angel or a messenger from heaven or something like that. In other words, they're not born of women. So if you're born of woman, you're a mortal. You're a flesh and blood mortal. You have a human father and a human mother. So what I tell my students is notice that if you start with Mark, which I think is our earliest record on John the Baptist in the New Testament, and then you move on to Matthew, and then to Luke, and then to John, do you know what progression you see? And I don't tell them. I give it to them like on a little quiz. You know, do these readings tonight and come back tomorrow and everybody write a one-page thing on what you noticed and do them in order. And you know what you notice? I'll give it away. Mark is like, yeah, he introduced him, but he's really important. You know, he's John the Baptist. He's the prophet Elijah. And Jesus says of him in Mark 8 and 9 that he is the Elijah to come. So Mark doesn't play him down so much. No. Matthew comes along and has the objection like, oh, I can't baptize you. You're too great. Mark doesn't have any objection. And then Luke comes along and he doesn't even mention the baptism. If you take a look, he has John preaching, and then it says, and when Jesus was baptized and was praying, you go like, but it doesn't actually have a scene where he baptizes Jesus. He's trying to say, no, he got the revelation of the dove and the voice. He didn't get it through, or distancing from John. And then you go to the Gospel of John, and it's not even mentioned, except John says, oh yeah, the guy that I said, I saw the Holy Spirit come on him, but there's no scene of the baptism. So you see how you're trying to distance the connection. That's a sign usually of something going on. Now, if somebody wants to say that John the Baptist is not that important, you're playing down the role of John. However, and I'll get, when we talk about how my mind has changed, the big thing my mind has changed on is the Gospel of John. Within the Gospel of John are embedded traditions that preserve earlier things that even Mark doesn't have. For example, that Jesus's earliest disciples are already disciples of John. I think that passes most historical tests because, as you said earlier, you don't want to say certain things if you're like, he's from Nazareth.
Right.
Like if you're faking something, oh, he actually was studying with John and he's a disciple of John. I actually think he was.
Me too.
And in the last month of his life, he goes to the Jesus Hideout in Jordan. Look up on my blog, Jesus Hideout in Jordan. I've discovered it and found it. And that's where John the Baptist hid from Herod Antipas and so forth. So there's a real connection. I think the mothers might be related. Luke preserves that. And when I say Luke, I don't know who wrote the book, but the author of Luke. I'm just referring to the books. But John says that Jesus baptized as well. He says he personally didn't do it, but he carried on a baptizing campaign. Okay.
Yeah.
Next.
That was really a great answer.
Scott Scamming is back. Great.
Yeah, he's back for more. Would you recommend any books on the historicity and textual criticisms of the book of Judges? Also, what do you think is the significance of Jotham making a polemic in which speaks of gods?
Boy, I'm out of my water there. But I think Emmanuel Toe's latest book on textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible is the master book. But specifically what he says about Judges, I'm not sure. I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar. I do have a translation of Genesis, and somebody said to me, you're not a Hebrew Bible scholar. How could you translate Genesis? Well, remember, I majored in biblical languages, and I studied Hebrew at Pepperdine University with, some of the great Jewish scholars, and at Chicago. So I'm able to read and work with classical Hebrew, but I'm not a Hebrew Bible critic.
Especially for Judges, that's a specific book.
That's right. But I think Emmanuel Tove would help. I'm intensely interested in, probably like you are, stop scamming. You're probably interested in everything like I am, from Jesus to Judges to, I am as well. I'm intensely interested in the Torah and the sources of the Torah and the different theories, not just the old Wellhausen thing, but everything up to, Joel Baden and everybody that's Joseph Blenkinsop. So I read intently, but I can't claim, training or expertise. I'm basically Maccabees to the Mishnah. That's kind of my bracket. So they could basically 200 BCE to 200 CE.
That's your word.
I know stuff like that. I know some of the early Christian history, but I kind of let a lot of that go. Leave it to Litwa and other people that know it so much better than I do. So
leave it to Litwa. That's a very common phrase. Leave it to Litwa. Let him translate all the Coptic stuff. I'm joking. But Alan Bird, thank you for super chat. Says, I still love the Jesus of the Gospels. Does James?
Do I love Jesus, or do I love the Jesus of the Gospels, or do I love studying the historical Jesus? Look, I wouldn't have spent 45 years, and counting grad school, 55 years. I wouldn't have spent 55 years studying somebody that I didn't think was utterly fascinating.
Sure.
I think about these things every day. I'm pretty absorbed with it. That would include Paul, though, as well, and early Christianity in general. But as far as the figure of Jesus, as I construct him in my own historical work, the Jesus dynasty, I would say, Alan, read the last chapter, which it's pretty well where I sort of take off my academic hat and sort of say what I really think. I kind of go with Crossan here. I think the message of Jesus of dismantling the powers, of stripping the principalities, so to speak. I can't go with all the mythology, but the agenda properly demythologized, I, like Schweitzer, find it to be incredibly compelling. Remember, Schweitzer said Jesus failed. He was wrong. The end didn't come. The movement was an apocalyptic movement, and dealing with the pieces of that disappointment is what the Gospels are all about. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest Jewish or Christian account after 70 AD of how do you follow the God of Israel after the destruction of Jerusalem. And Mark is telling you how to do that. And so I do think that the Jesus who emerges in my own understanding of the figure of that time is extraordinary enough for us to pay attention to today. I think some of his sayings and his teachings are dismantling of the powers that be. They sort of break down strongholds in that sense. However, I think he was a human and part of a first century culture and time. And certainly he seems, for example, to think that diseases are caused by Satan and maybe somebody's demon possessed, or at least he's reported to have said that. That's the other problem. You know, who's the real Jesus? But I don't want to demythologize him to the point that I take him out of his Greco-Roman culture. I think he's very much a Hellenistic guy. I could shock you and say, I think he's a magician. But if you got to understand that, not in the way Morton Smith has been slandered in his work on Jesus the Magician, but understanding what a Hellenistic magician really does.
Oh, yeah.
And that is a charismatic, shamanistic individual who's able to negotiate or claims to be able to negotiate the heavenly world. I think he did claim that. A lot of that I'm not going to resonate with as a modern person. My assumptions are different than that. But it doesn't mean that there's not within the ethical kinds of challenges. The thing that made Schweitzer give up his position as a professor and go get his medical degree and go to Africa and work as a medical missionary.
Wow.
And then work against nuclear arms and so forth until he died in the 60s.
What a life.
What I really, the quote I always give of Schweitzer, and it's at the end of his book, I won't take time to turn to it, but I'll just badly paraphrase it. He says, Jesus set his wheel to the, he set his shoulder to the wheel of history, and he lunged with all his might to try to push it forward, and it lurched back and crushed him. And I think what he's trying to say is what he wanted to do was to revive the prophetic ideal that we see in Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, and the different Hebrew prophets, Micah, justice, righteousness, and truth, and throw in a little loving kindness. And you've got these virtues that are so foreign to a selfish, narcissistic, power-ridden culture that was the same in Jesus' time as it probably is today. Riches, money, power, and so forth. And I think he tried to dismantle those powers. He tried to disarm them, and to some degree was... I do love the Jesus of the Gospels in a certain way, but I also think you have to find the right Jesus. I don't think he spoke in the voice that he's often quoted as speaking in, because it's inconsistent with material that I think is earlier and more reliable. So,
yep. Good answer. Stop Scamming Man again, another one. As well as Jesus being less refined in Mark, does it also portray him as more out of his depth to begin with, getting angry, bad crowd control, and wardrobe malfunction with his magic robe?
Now, what is the wardrobe malfunction? I know the guy running naked in the garden.
That might be what he's talking about.
Oh, yeah. I don't think that was Jesus, but maybe he thinks it is. Anyway, I want you, be sure, and I know you will, Stop Scamming Man will definitely be interested in this. You're going to have to wait and hear my whole thing on Mark, I think, to answer it fully. But the problem with Mark and the challenge of Mark, I think he has a decent historical outline of Jesus coming from Nazareth, joining the Baptist movement, preaching and healing, casting out demons and so forth, ending up in Jerusalem, confronting the authorities, getting killed, and being reported seen alive after his death. So he's got kind of the framework. But the drama that Mark produces, it seems to me, and this is what Norman Perrin also believed and what Strauss believed, it's Mark's creation. And there you get a fine line between enjoying the drama. Think of it as an artistic work, and you're watching 3 films on a historical figure. One of them's Mark, one's Matthew, one's Luke, and one's John. Or think of 3 paintings in which somebody says, paint how you felt when you heard the World Trade Center was coming down. Somebody might paint realism. Somebody might paint abstract. Somebody just might paint craziness, you see. It's that kind of thing. So what Mark is a 3-part drama produced like a play with the curtain going up. Yeah. And I'll give you a hint and you'll immediately notice what I'm saying. How does Mark open? There's an omniscient narrator that runs through Mark. Any novelist knows about this. Mm-hmm. You got to decide, are you going to have an omniscient narrator? There's who's recording this? It's not a first-person guy. So right. How does it start? The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Then you go, this is me. Shh. They don't know. Don't tell anybody. Then the lights, get dark. Curtain goes up, and we see actors on the stage. John the Baptist first, Pharisees coming, people asking questions. And nobody on the scene knows who he is, but you've already been told, you see. So because of that omniscient narrator that's taking us through and doing the transitions from one scene to the next, and he actually writes transition verses, like he'll do a major part and do a transition, and then a major part and transition. It's hard to just take that and say, oh, that's the historical Jesus. But as far as him being out of his element or out of his depth, that's part of the drama. And I will talk about that. It's going to be a 6-part series on Mark, so you can see that. But I really think it's compelling. Some of you know my student, Ryan Cataldo, Derek's friend, and he's the one who got me. He said, go on Derek's show, James. And I don't go on these YouTube shows. They're too crazy. And he goes, no, Derek reads, he'll read, he'll listen. So I went on Derek's show, and I loved it. He came to Charlotte, and we did a bunch of stuff together, and we become good friends. And then I met Neal. But anyway, it was like there was just this idea that basically you shouldn't, how would I say this? I don't know. I'm just going to drop that.
Okay. That was a really good answer, by the way. I was really enjoying that. It was like the way you explained how Mark sets the stage. It reminds me of like how Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung would interpret the Gospels. Like it's the hero of 1,000 faces.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
well, what I was going to say about Ryan, I will say, I was going to go further into Mark and I pulled back. But what I want to say about Ryan Cataldo, he'll love being mentioned, I'm sure, is he finished his master's with me. He wrote it on Mark 13, and I totally disagree with his thesis, and I passed it because he made good arguments.
Sure.
And he knows I disagree, but I'm slowly pulling him to a more eschatological view, I think. But anyway, he's doing his PhD this fall at Hebrew Union. So we're very proud of him. So I mention him because if you ask him, what do you most remember from the 5 classes you had with Tabor? He would go, hands down, Gospel of Mark. So that's a little pitch for what's coming.
Nice.
It's my thing next to Paul, Mark and Paul. So.
Nice. Next one is from Yakuvi Itzram. Evidence of Peter in Rome, Alexandria, I guess, and/or.
Yeah. I think it's very slim to none. It's very difficult. I mainly am basing this on a MA level thesis paper. It didn't become the person's thesis, David Clawson. If you Google him, he has 2 books out. One on one's an archaeological book, but his latest one's on Paul. David Clawson, I would recommend him. I believe he might have put his paper online that he did for me, but it's all the archaeological and historical evidence on the Peter tomb. And he does Paul. I worked on Paul as well, but the Peter tomb, particularly in the sarcophagus and when it was open and the bones and what was found and everything. The problem with it, as I understand it from reading his work, and again, I haven't specialized in it, is that we have some vague references to Peter and Paul dying and being heroic, martyrs in Rome, but they're not absolutely as straightforward. And by the way, I recommend David's books, but I think if you go to his blog, which will be linked in there somewhere, I believe you'll find his paper on Peter. So I'm kind of skeptical of that. The other reason is there is a fragment of an ossuary that we do have, a burial box from the 1st century found on the Mount of Olives. And the person buried in it is Simon Bar Yonah, which is a fairly rare name. Jonah is not a common name in the time. And Shimon Bar Yonah is the name we have for Peter. Peter's his Greek name that shows up in the Gospels, but his real name is Simon, son of Jonah. So there is an ossuary with that. Now, would it mean it's Peter's, the Peter we know buried on the Mount of Olives? Very possibly, because we have a lot of evidence of early Christians burying on the Mount of Olives. Why would they bury there? Because of the tradition that Jesus is going to come down to the Mount of Olives when he returns.
Front row seats, baby.
50-yard line, front row seats. It's not the nosebleed bleachers. You're right there. So some people dispute that reading. Stephen Fawn has a different way of reading it. I still find it pretty convincing that it's Shimon Bar Yonah, but that wouldn't prove anything either way. But look at Clawson's paper. I would say no, neither Rome nor Alexandria. This is a later tradition.
Okay.
Now, Paul in Rome is different, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Paul in Rome is different. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. The next one is from Stop Scamming Man. Once again, he's the star of the show. He might as well just come on here. I'm just kidding. What should we make of the historical Mary and her place in the faith in light of Mark 3, Luke 8, and Matthew 12? Jesus shrugging off his mother, arriving, saying his followers are his mother and brothers.
Yeah. Good question. I'm glad you put that out because everybody thinks about it. Let me answer it in a roundabout way, and I'll get to it. It's really odd to me that people form whole bodies of assured knowledge often on one verse, one word, or one passage. In this case, it's a passage repeated 3 times. Mark's the source. Now, let me give you an example. Was Jesus a carpenter? There are people driving pickup trucks in my neighborhood that say things like, my boss was a Jewish carpenter, right? And you don't have to say Jesus. If I ask my students on the first day of class, I usually go, was Jesus Jewish or Christian? Just to play around with them. And they go like, well, God, that's hard to answer, Dr. Taylor, because I think he was Jewish, but he was a Christian, right? I go, okay, how about, what was his profession? Carpenter, everybody knows that. Okay, what do we really know? Mark 6, verse 3, only reference to him as a carpenter. Isn't it funny? One mention in one verse of the New Testament certainly takes over the world, and everybody on earth that knows anything about Jesus, oh yeah, he was a carpenter in the 1st century, even though the word doesn't even mean carpenter. It means technician or tecton, like architect means a builder. So whether he used wood or stone, I think more likely stone. Now, why would I start there? Stop Scamming Man, he's ahead of me, I think, because this passage is like that. Everybody knows that Jesus didn't like or support his family because in Mark, he says, who is my mother, brother, and sisters? Here's my understanding of that. I think it's a mi casa su casa moment. We're at the Peter's house in Capernaum, which, by the way, has been excavated, and the first century level has been found. And it's a typical house right on the shore that was later remembered as a shrine, and finally a Byzantine church, and finally, later even a Crusader structure. But anyway, either way, Jesus sets up his headquarters in Mark on the shores of Capernaum. He takes his mother and brothers there. So they're living there. He's moved the family to Capernaum. There's such a crowd there, you can't even get in the door. And they're trying to let this guy down by opening the straw roof, the thatch roof, let this guy down for healing. And somebody says, your mother and brothers are outside. You need to let them in or whatever. And I think he's basically saying, all of you are welcome. You're all my mothers and brothers. So that the bond that he wants to have in the new community is a family bond. So rather than putting down his mother and brothers, he's actually exalting them and saying, the bond that I feel with my family, because I believe Mary was an incredibly important influence on Jesus, the bond I feel with my family is no less than the bond I feel with all of you. We're all together. Wow. Let's give up father, mother, brother, sister, lands, houses, and let's all live. So my house is your house, and my father is your father, and my mother is your mother.
He was very progressive for his time.
He was.
By the way, Myth Vision Derek popped in and said, thank you, Neal and Dr. Tabor. I'm painting my house, and you guys are helping me so much. Thank you.
He can't do that unless he puts in some money. We're not going to. You read it for free. Come on, Derek.
Guys, let's get to 150 likes. We're at 115. Let's get to a 150. So thank you guys for watching and sending the super chats. We got a couple more. But yeah, so far, everybody who's been participating, liking, and all that, thank you guys.
How long are we going to go? Like an hour? And we got 2 more.
We got a couple more. Do you want to just kind of speed through?
No, I want to go. If we got a couple more, and then I want to talk about 2 areas where I've changed my mind.
Yeah, I'm in no rush. Yeah. So just as long as you want to, we're good. Okay.
Other than wanting to have a beer in the backyard by the pool.
Yeah.
I'm retired, right?
Yeah. You can do that. You can do that later.
But that'll come.
Yeah,
no problem.
Stop Scamming Man drops a 20 this time and says, while apologists clutch at straws to make the OT fit Christianity, Isaiah 9:6-7 speaks of a child being born who will rule and be called Mighty God and Everlasting Father. What sort of being is Isaiah describing here?
Okay, this is that Pele Yoetz El Gibor Avi Ad Shar Shalom, right?
He's giving
What is that? Wonderful Counselor.
Hezekiah, right?
Pele Yoetz El Gibor, Mighty God, Avi Ad, Everlasting Father, Shar Shalom, Prince of Peace. I would understand that, like many other names, to be a name of praise for the one wonderful in counsel. The same phrase, Pele Yoetz, is used elsewhere. If you check it, Stop Scamming Man, get your, whatever Bible concordance program you use, and look, you'll have to probably use the Hebrew to find it, Pele Yoetz. But God is called great in counsel. So it's like saying, wonderful in counsel is the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And Prince throws people off because we think prince and king are different, and they're not in Hebrew. Both just mean ruler. Malak, king, to rule, and right. Sar, just to rule. So it's not the old English thing of the king and the prince. You're just a prince. Ginosar, the garden of the king, is a town by Migdal. Because is it Hezekiah? Who is it? I'm starting to think, and I'd love to hear what Stop Scamming Man. He might have to put in another $10 to answer us. So we'll read his answer. But I think it might be Isaiah's child.
Sure.
Because he goes on to say that my children are signs and wonders of what the Lord's going to do, which is what? Emmanuel, showing the presence of God with us. And then he talks about these children. So take a look at all of chapter 8 into chapter 9, because remember, chapter 9 continues this.
Yeah, of course. That's the thing.
You got to start with 8, go into 9, and then 9, maybe till the end of 9. And I think it works out to be just like Maller, Shaller, Hashbaz is a kid's name. It's a message. So the message is that God is going to do wonders because he's wonderful in counsel by bringing this child. It's not that the child isn't remarkable,
right?
But the child's going to sit on the throne of David.
And I would say this real quick, just before we get to the next one. No matter what you think, if it's Jesus, if it's Isaiah, or if it's Emmanuel, or if it's Hezekiah, read the whole chapter. Don't just read the one sentence and make a claim what you think it means. Get the whole context of the book. Read the whole book, and then you make a educated choice on what you think it means. Right?
Well, start with 7, go through 8, all the way through 9.
Right, and then you'll have an idea. Okay.
Yeah.
Imposter suspense. Oh, excuse me. I fixed my phone was vibrating. If Imposter suspense, any idea how James really died? Different way in Josephus and Eusebius.
Yeah. Of course, Eusebius is depending on other sources, Hegesippus and so forth. So, but he is the way we get it. It's kind of like the last Hashmonean king was Antigonus. Okay, his name is Antigonus. I did a show with Derek on this. It's going to come out, and we have DNA on him, and his ossuary has been found. It's really interesting. Wow. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because we have a report that he was beheaded, and we have another report that Mark Antony crucified him. So what is it? The skeletal remains seem to show both. So I think it's possible that he was thrown off the corner of the temple, which is the southeastern side, the high point of the temple wall, down into the Kidron Valley. And then he was stoned and beaten to death with a club. And you could see that in a kind of a mob action. Throw him off the wall and then beat him to death. And I think there was a burial of some type in the Kidron Valley. And we have later references to his ossuary being moved up to the Mount of Olives up to Mount Zion, which is the southwest hill, the highest point where I've excavated now for 10 years. And that's during the 4th century when the Byzantine church is going to be built into the 5th century. The Holy Mother of God Church, honoring Mary. And they bring James Ossuary up from the Kidron Valley. Then it disappears. And of course, if you believe that James Ossuary is in fact James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, there's new evidence now that it came from the Talpiot tomb. And by that, I mean the tomb with Jesus and the other folks in it. So
fascinating.
Okay.
So Topic Discussed, by the way, is a channel you want to subscribe to. It's a good friend of the channel, good friend of Derek, good friend of mine. I thought Derek, I thought Derek is taking weekends off.
Well, Ryan probably has something to say about that, and I believe we need to paint this house and get it on the market. So
yeah,
Derek's making a major move. He's going to be with his family in Washington State. I live in North Carolina, so I love having him here. But
yeah,
anyway,
Stop Scamming Man is back for another. Says it boggles the mind of how little there is on Jesus' sisters, even in later Gospels. Even in Catholic tradition, which is full of stuff on associates and even among liberal fiction writers, an eccentric revisionist. Good point.
Absolutely. It's a really bad and unfortunate thing. And it's part of the culture. Mark 6:3, James, Yose, Simon, Jude, are these not his brothers? Are not his sisters with us? Like what? They don't have names? We've got some traditional names that pop up, Maria, Salome, and Sarah. But, they're never called the sisters. Richard Balcom, I highly recommend his book, Jude and the Relatives of Jesus. Highly recommend Richard's work on that. It's the best work on the family. He tries to find anything we can find. But the problem is pretty transparent, I think. Brothers are a problem enough, but why have sisters that become even more of a problem? Because Mary's declared to be not only virgin, but ever virgin, right? And ever virgin means what? Not only was she a virgin when she became pregnant with Jesus, and that did not involve a man, that's the faith, but also those brothers and sisters are not her children. So even though she's a Jewish woman who gets married and Joseph knows her, according to Matthew's tradition, right, after the birth of Jesus, she doesn't just live like a normal Jewish woman and have children. She becomes, let's face it, a sister, a nun, and part of a 4th and 5th century Catholic piety that Shoemaker's written so much about, Marian devotion in the early church.
Sure.
And it's so important. Stephen's work is just the best. There's nothing better. My book, I stand in his shadow. I don't know if he'll agree with all of my book, but it's called The Lost Mary. And I run to the hilt with the other interpretation that she has 7 to 9 children. They are biological children. She's a Jewish woman. She gives her children these Hashmonean names, these messianic names, and she is a very important figure in early Christianity. I wish we knew more about the sisters, but we don't. But the same thing has happened with Mary Magdalene, who just shows up at the end and at the cross, and all of a sudden she's in charge of the burial and hanging out with the mother and maybe the sister Salome. Who is she? If you read French, you can get the book now. Otherwise, you got to wait till next year. It's been held back by COVID. It's with Knopf, Knoph, but we hope it'll be coming out in 2023.
Wow.
Big plans for that book. I want to give this woman her life back.
Yeah.
She was I think, a fierce woman who raised these 2 boys, at least the 2 we know, Jesus and James. They're pretty towering figures in the 1st century. So
Change the
a
world.
lot of my colleagues are probably going to go, oh man, there you go again, making all this stuff out of very little evidence. But wait till you read the evidence. You got to look for evidence. There's sources that survive later that we can extrapolate and connect with sources that we know. It becomes like a trail.
Yeah.
That you follow and you go, oh my God, there's another clue. I think it goes this way, and you keep following the trail.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so
JC with the $10. Thank you for the super chat. What influences did Platonic ideas have on the Pentateuch? Paul, do you find Russell Gamerkin's scholarship convincing about the creation of the Hebrew Bible being in Alexandria?
Oh boy, Russell and I email each other, and we know each other from the past in a tangential way. But I have to say, I haven't read his books. I know quite a bit about what he says. I do know that he is one of the few people that, without doing the formal academic route of becoming a professor and, building notoriety and so forth, his books have been accepted by very critical scholarly presses. And everybody feels that Russell is somebody
Absolutely
to deal with. And he certainly is. And he's just a hell of a nice guy. And he's very modest, but pretty determined. And I would really hesitate to wager an opinion on that. My tendency would be the other way, to see some of the materials that make up the 5 books of Moses, so called, as being embedded in much earlier materials. But again, isn't it nice when I can say it's about 1,000 years out of my field? Although, if Russell's right, it's sort of getting close to my area, because I do work on the Hellenistic period. So I think I better read his stuff.
I will say this, I have been learning Greek lately. I'm taking Greek classes, and I Septuagint, Old Testament, the first Genesis 1:1 matches up with Hesiod's. And so in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And then you look at Hesiod, it says, in the beginning, chaos brought forth Gaia and Aranos. Same 2 words in Greek. So it's like, if he's right, he's onto something. That's all I'm saying. I can't.
And the thing is, though, and Russell might deal with this, you're going to find this kind of origin story, though, in Babylonian and Sumerian materials, and I'm sure he deals with that, and in some Egyptian materials, and some Sanskrit materials as well, with some of their mythology. So again, totally out of my field, but JC, I appreciate the contribution.
Absolutely. Jennifer Silvis, wardrobe malfunction, hem of his garment? That's a good question.
Maybe. I don't know if that's what he meant or not. The hem of his garment is, if you put it into Hebrew, it's the tzit. It's these cords that you see on a Jewish prayer shawl today. Or if you're talking to somebody who's an Orthodox observant Jew, they wear a kind of a cotton T-shirt. It's not really a T-shirt. It's kind of a vest. Could be a T-shirt that goes under their clothing. And they either let those hems come out or not. Those strings, we would call them strings, or fringes is the proper name. But apparently in the 1st century, we know something about this. This was woven into the garment, these tzitzit, as they're called, and they were dyed blue from a certain snail in the Mediterranean. And they were very holy. Yeah, they call it to kill it, right?
Okay.
And so that would not be so much a wardrobe malfunction as just her being down on the ground in a crowd and reaching up under and grabbing just, you could say, the coattail of somebody in a long coat or something like that. Now, let me tell you about another wardrobe function that is a wardrobe function that might interest you, Jennifer, for your $199. And that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Go to the community rule, the Sirach, Hayakat it's called. You can get any Vermes, Vermes, English translation, first document in there. And it lists at the end all the violations and what you're going to get punished for. For example, what if you spit during the assembly? Wow. Or what if your robe comes open and your private genitals get exposed during the assembly? Presumably not on purpose, but you just sit a certain way. Each one of those gives a penalty. I forget what it is. Something like, you got to go 3 weeks outside the camp. And they had these caves. I helped excavate the caves with Broshi and Eschel years ago, where we think the penitents would have to go and live, but they're outside of the holy area of Qumran. Now that would be a wardrobe function.
I wonder if it's ever happened to a prophet, to like the prophet, or who, like a almost Messiah figure, and like.
Well, Isaiah goes naked. Do you remember that?
That's right.
He goes naked. So
yeah, that's a crazy part. Yeah.
Yeah. All so right. If you have, I want to wind up the super chats, but I don't want to cut off anybody that wants to give to Derek. How many more do you have there?
We got a couple. I think we have like 2 or 3 left.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it real quick, and then let me just finish up with how my mind has changed and stayed the same.
Of course.
In 45 years.
Jason Cachulo, older reliable gospels. Who was real Jesus?
I guess it means, are there older reliable? I think chronology and looking at the Gospels chronologically goes a long way. You can find, if you go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, staying with those New Testament documents first, almost any issue you're going to find a progression of theologizing and mythology. In Mark, there's no virgin birth. In Matthew, it's not clear that there's a virgin birth, maybe, but there's a pregnancy of a married woman. Luke, definitely a virgin birth. Mary goes, I haven't known anybody. John is more incarnational, like, oh, the word became flesh. So it gets higher and higher, more and more elaborated. Same with the family of Jesus. Luke doesn't even mention the brothers. He's reading Mark 6. He covers the chapter and he goes, oh, the brothers, yeah, their name, but I don't really want to emphasize them. I'm not going to put that in there. And Luke has rewritten Mark. Remember, he's rewriting Mark. So you see this tendency. So it doesn't mean Mark is the best, but it's where to begin. I would also begin with the two source sayings material. I think a lot of that is really early. And then I think you have to move on and you have to look at each source in terms of where it comes from, what we know about it, what we call the Sitz and Leben, what is its context and so forth. The Gospel of Thomas is one that many scholars include as really, certainly the Jesus Seminar and Krosnick felt that it was really important. I would give it less weight, and yet I do find within it, based on April DeConnick's work, which is just the best, she thinks it's emerging from the community of James the Just. And of course, he's referred to. And she makes a really good case that we can peel back layers and find some original material there that could relate to what we would call the more historical Jesus.
Wow. And this is the last.
I would start with Paul.
Okay.
I wouldn't start with the Gospels. Paul says things about Jesus that are our earliest source.
Sure.
Excuse me, I've been talking for over an hour here.
Yeah.
One of the things he says is Jesus was of the spermata, the seed of David, according to the flesh. And yet it's discussed by everybody whether he was really a descendant of David. Wasn't that just something that Matthew made up in Matthew 1 and Luke made up in Luke 3 in those genealogies? And yet our earliest source, Paul, seems to say that without worry about any particular person saying, what? Where did you get that? That's crazy. And he is writing to, one of the major Christian groups, and it's kind of a formal treatise. He wants to be on his best behavior. So I would start with Paul. You don't get as much as you want, but he certainly mentions the crucifixion. He talks about who crucified Jesus and why. And you can get more from Paul than you would think. But it's kind of by the way stuff. But by the way stuff sometimes is better than concocted stuff, right? If I mention something in passing, it's just, oh yeah, that. But if I concoct it and build it up, I may be trying to create something that is secondary. So you can get a lot from Paul on Jesus, more than people think.
Great answer. The last one is from B Bear, and it says, is there much evidence for historical Thomas?
Boy, Thomas is the thing. When you look at the 12 apostles, B Bear, it's really interesting that I ask my students, usually I do these things the first day of class. This is my Jesus class that I used to teach for 40 years. And one is, was Jesus a Jew or a Christian? What was his profession? And then I go, who can name the 12 apostles in order? Or if you don't get the order, let's try. So I do it on the board with them. Usually I go, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Well, we got 4. We got 8 to go. Let's do 4 more. They'll go like, Philip, Bartholomew, or is it Thaddeus? Uh, who is it? Who are the others? Come on, Neal. This is your
Oh,
quiz.
there's two Simons, right? Simon Zealot.
No, wait. The second four, you got to do them in order.
Oh, I forgot where you started with.
Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Those are the fisherman brothers.
Okay.
And then
Thaddeus,
Philip.
Philip, Simon the Zealot.
No, I'm going to wait on him. He's
Judas,
part of the
Judas.
Yeah.
Judas. Okay. We got Tom.
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, usually they will get Thomas. They'll get Thomas because there's this good story about him. There's one good story about him, right? The Doubting Thomas story.
Right.
So is there good historical evidence? Just that he's named in all four lists, and we have this one story of him. So, it means the twin, which is one of the questions and problems. And then we got the Gospel of Thomas, and the name that's in that letter as well, or that document, whatever you want to call it, that treatise, that collection of Jesus sayings. There's later traditions of where he went, but you're going to find on a lot of these traditions, when people trace them, they end up going to the 2nd and 3rd century with these legends. Right. Oh yeah, Thomas went to India and he was killed by an elephant. What I always ask when people quote things is, what is the earliest source you know for that?
Right.
And often people don't know the source, but Wikipedia even has that. And you'll find it's going to be late 2nd, early 3rd century. So it's really hard to jump back.
Yeah.
I would go with the 12 names. I think they're out there enough that maybe they're real. Now, I did want to say that the Jewish sources give different names for the apostles.
Yeah, I remember that.
Did you know that? Yeah. And some of them correspond and some of them don't. So that's kind of interesting. And whether they're making fun of them with these funny little nicknames, some people think, we're not sure. So
yeah.
But I would say, no, there's not much evidence for historical Thomas. But, I'm not so much into thinking these characters were made up as that they were embellished and became kind of the way in which you would spin around them a certain story. Like if you say, what's the historical evidence for Thomas meeting Jesus a week afterwards and putting his hands or his fingers in his side and all that? I mean, there's no historical evidence for that. There's a report in John. But the reports of resurrection in John 20 are very problematic, as in Luke.
Yeah.
The ones in Luke 24. Those are the most problematic.
Right.
The earliest is Mark, and there are no appearances. And that's probably the earliest view. My own view is that Mark's community believed that Jesus experienced what we call apotheosis, or ascent to heaven immediately.
Right.
And that he left his clothes behind, you might say, his body behind, and was transformed into a life-giving spirit, according to Paul. And that's another subject.
Yeah.
So why don't I finish up with a couple things that I wrote down, because Derek asked me to think about this.
Yeah.
The first thing I would mention, and I'm going back to grad school, what I first assumed and knew that now I think I was incorrect on, okay? The first thing is, when I did graduate work at the University of Chicago, and even before that, I gave almost no weight or interest to the Gospel of John. I thought it was late. I thought it was secondary. I thought it probably had nothing of any interest to someone wanting to do the Jesus of history, plenty for the Christ of faith. And that's because of the so-called high Christology, which I'm not so sure is very high, by the way. Actually, John has a passage in chapter 17 where Jesus is praying to God and says that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus, the Messiah, whom you've sent. That's pretty good standard messianic theology you know. So you got to be careful even with John. But anyway, Paul Anderson, I name particularly because he's led the charge on this, James Charlesworth and others. We've been at the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, now for years, several volumes published. I've got a couple papers out on this, in which we try to show that the Gospel of John has these composite layers, and there's actually a narrative framework that should really be considered. And it has some alternative traditions. Like Capernaum becomes less of a center for Jesus, and Cana in the Galilee, not the traditional Cana that the pilgrims visit, but the real Cana that's been discovered now by by Tom McCullough and others, that there's just a lot. It's a different tradition that needs to also be considered. And sometimes they combine well and sometimes they don't. So I have changed on that. If, when I first began my work, I would do John in 1 day, 2 days. If I'm doing a historic, oh, well, then there's John. There's not really that much in that. And I was thinking more of my evangelical Christian students that carry around a little Gospel of John, like, this is all I need. Believe in Jesus. He died for your sins. You go to heaven. John 3:16. That's my favorite
all you
verse.
need. Yeah.
That's John's all you need. And he's been translated more than any book of the Bible, by the way.
Wow.
So you can understand why.
Right.
So I've changed on that. And I've actually used John to guide some of my archaeology. And I think we found some pretty good confirmation. Like Pool of Siloam is now uncovered. You're going to go there with me, Neal, you and Derek, and all kinds of things. Pilate's judgment seat. John has that down very square, and everything fits. The fact that Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, the high priest, and yet Annas still controls all the power because he has 5 other sons. I believe it's 5, might be 6, that are also high priests, including him. It's a mafia. It's a first century priestly mafia. The same family that kills Jesus kills James, the brother of Jesus. That's Annas, son of Annas, in the year 62. And so maybe 63. We're not sure exactly the date of that. 62, 63. So I've changed on that. The other big change, if you take my book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, it's my new book. I should hold it up, I guess, just so people can see it.
Oh, I could show it on the Amazon if you want.
Yeah, I like to hold it, but you can show it.
Okay.
So if you take this book, this is based on my dissertation that I did in the 80s. Okay, notice the 80s. So that's quite a few years ago. And I was convinced that the opponents of Paul throughout his letters, he has these people that hate him and oppose him, so-called Judaizers. I was convinced that they were some kind of Gnosticizing, spiritual, they're usually called Pumatikers, charismatic types that are also into their mystical Judaism. And that's what I present in that book. But as I rewrite it and redo it, and in my book, Jesus and Paul, this one, I pick up on F.C. Bauer. F.C. Bauer, 1830s. Guess what? He was a teacher of Strauss.
Wow.
You know who else taught Strauss?
Who?
Hegel and Schleiermacher.
Hegel?
The great.
Hegel?
Yes.
No way.
I'm telling you.
This was a real academic legend, right?
That's right. We're talking about the Tübingen School.
Wow.
And F.C. Bauer argued, and others have taken this up, and I'm convinced of it, that Paul broke with James. That James and Paul have a lot of friction, and he finally broke with James, and James with Paul. And the book of Acts is very carefully trying to cover this over. But that Paul, in fragments of 2 Corinthians, lets it out very clearly. And finally, I call it the Battle of the Apostles. It was a knockdown, drag out break. And I think F.C. Bauer argued this. And what happens with New Testament studies, I've had various colleagues write me after I put the book out, and they said, Tabor, don't you know that F.C. Bauer was refuted thoroughly 150 years ago? How could you take up that old song and dance? And, I'm going to quote my teacher, Robert Grant, who told us early on in graduate school at Chicago, read the old stuff first. He says, and this was in the 70s. So to some of you, that's the old stuff. But he was thinking, don't run after every modern scholar to decay. Go read David Strauss, read Reimarus, read Schweitzer in German. Read Reitzenstein, the greatest scholar of Hellenistic religions who's ever lived. Read Fraser. And one of the things that
absolutely read Fraser, but
he always said was read F.C. Bauer. Everybody said, F.C. Bauer. He said that James and Paul were opposed. He had a Hegelian dichotomy working. Well, it did happen to be a Hegelian dichotomy. But guess what? Every movement that's ever split is a Hegelian dichotomy. How about red and blue states today?
Yeah, it's Hegelian, yeah.
How about Trump and Biden? How about abortion rights and this and that? All it means is that, how about fascism and communism? On and on and on. We have these dualisms because it's the nature of reality.
Yes.
I go one way and somebody goes, well, not only are you wrong, but you're so wrong that you're almost off the edge of the spectrum. And yet, Bauer didn't say that. And I think his work is convincing. And I like some of the older works like Harnack on the Book of Acts and Cadbury. We're talking 1920s. So the old is good. That's a quote from Jesus. He said, the old is good. Talking about wine, actually.
Right.
The old is good. It can be good. So, I'm proud to stand with the Tübingen School on that. I think it's valid. And read my argument. I really think
I agree.
They made a break. And I think that is what I would call the beginning of Christianity.
Nice.
For that reason. But it was very small, very fledgling, and not very influential at first. Till after 70. And remember, Mark and Matthew and Luke, you have to read as post-Pauline.
Right.
They're essentially recasting versions of Paul in many ways.
Yeah.
You can really see it in the Last Supper. I mean, there it's just living color. Eat my body, drink my blood. That's Paul. But it's in Mark, and then it gets in Matthew, and then it gets in Luke. Doesn't get in John, by the way, in that form. So I think you've got to realize that early Paul is our best handle on the first 20 years of the movement. But James is tough. It's like having one side of a conversation. But Luke goes a long way towards showing us, by muting James, he really mutes him. Like when he has all the apostles and Peter stands up and preaches and everything's ramping along, churches started, and he goes, oh, Mary and his brothers were there too. Oh, small detail there. This is the matriarch of the whole movement and his brother who's in charge. And Luke just says, yeah, they were there. Now later in Acts 15, he can't just go, yeah, they were there too. Because James stands up and makes the decision in favor of a certain position that most people think Paul is favored in. But if you read Paul's letters, Paul says, eat what is set before you, asking no questions. And also says you can buy meat in the market, even though it's been offered to idols. Do you seriously think James thought that?
No.
Because even Luke has to say that he was against that. So what is Paul? Paul is, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To those without the law, I became without the law. I'm not really without the law, but I'm under the law of Christ.
He also criticized Peter for doing that same thing.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, Peter's one way to want some people, and another."
So that's the other way I've changed. But the main way I've changed, and I'll close with this, Derek. God, we're 2 hours. People are going to get so tired of this.
2 more super chats just popped up. If you want to get to them real quick.
Well, I got to give you this first.
Sure.
Until 1990, like throughout the grad school, teaching at Notre Dame, teaching at William and Mary. Finally got to Charlotte, 1990. Nothing to do with Charlotte, but I get to Charlotte, taught there 33 years. I decided to start going and doing archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist, but I joined Eisenman at Qumran. We had a dig license. I been director of several archaeological projects. I've dug at Cephas. I've dug at various places all over Jerusalem, mainly. John the Baptist, Suba, where we have the cave of John the Baptist that has first century evidence going back to the time of John the Baptist of habitation and use of the cave for mikvah and so forth. So including the material evidence with the textual has changed everything for me. When you read the book, The Jesus Dynasty, it's kind of a page turner if you're into this stuff. But what you're really going to notice is I always take you on the ground, under the ground, on the scene, because we know so much more. When I first went to Israel in 1962, we knew nothing. We're walking 30 feet above the first century Herodian level. Nothing had been uncovered. Wow. And now all over the city, you can walk on the Herodian stones. You can see underground. We're going to go underground on the tour and see Herodian houses underneath the modern houses reconstructed.
That's wild.
With what was found in them. And this is from the time of Jesus.
I cannot wait.
So we have a lot of context, you know. So.
We're going to fill everything, by the way, with high quality cameras. Thanks to you guys for donating. Thank you guys.
So I think that 2 hours is too long, you know.
Yeah. Let's just get these super chats out the way because they paid and they're donating.
Oh, if they paid, we'll do it really quick and people can just get bored.
Vesper, okay. What could be in the Vatican secret archive?
Oh my God. It's not just the secret archives as much as like people not being allowed to see everything.
Right, you can't even go.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much, you know, Dan Brown and all that, and there's going to be secret gospels that were burnt, but they have them.
Never know.
But I just think, just like Martin Smith found his manuscript, which I believe is authentic, in the Mar Saba monastery, you know, the secret gospel of Mark, I believe that material is available. And the most intriguing thing is whether there could be some things from the Jewish temple, which the Vatican denies, but we have stories about the booty taken from Rome being on display and so forth. And could some of it still be around? Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, one more and we'll let people go.
JB Whitebirch says, "Congratulations, Professor. Life gets even more fun after retirement."